After the widespread success and praise of 2007's FPS video game Bioshock, it didn't take long for Hollywood to begin planning a film adaptation of the property. The project got off to a great start, nabbing director Gore Verbinski, hot off his Pirates of the Caribbean and The Ring fame, as well as the Aviator writer John Logan to its creative team. But even though the movie had everything going for it and seemed like a sure thing to get made, eventually it didn't. There probably are countless reasons as to why the studio, at that time being Universal, became hesitant about the endeavor, but the biggest of them is the most clear and predictable: money. Verbinski wanted to create a big-budget, hard R horror thriller experience, but after the commercial failure of other R-rated blockbusters like Watchmen, Universal got cold feet and gave the director two options: either make the movie PG-13 or film it for a lower budget. This eventually led to Verbinski dropping out, and though he was quickly replaced and still remained attached as producer, it was ultimately Bioshock creator Ken Levine who decided to pull the plug on the project, simply because he, along with distributor Take-Two Interactive, felt it was better to have no Bioshock movie at all than to have one that would end up being just another average video game adaptation. Years went on, and despite occasional sparks, no Bioshock movie ever saw the light of day. Until a decade later, director Verbinski came out with a movie that, though wasn't exactly Bioshock, frankly very much felt like it.
Are you ready, Mr. Lockhart?
A Cure for Wellness, released in early 2017, was directed by Verbinski, on top of which he also, along with writer Justin Haythe, has story credit, indicating that this was something he set in motion. But even though the trailers and the promotions give out a certain Rapture-esque vibe, is that really what the movie is? Is it really the Bioshock adaptation that failed to get made all those years earlier?
Feel the liquid rise, moving up your ankles, your calves.
The setups of these two different narratives are undeniably very much alike. Both feature a lone protagonist who, after a devastating crash, ends up stuck in a strange, ominous populated installation secluded from the rest of the world. Bioshock has the underwater city of Rapture. Cure has the wellness center located high up in the Swiss Alps. Even though the plotlines start to grow apart with time, differing in speed as well as details and specifics, the core of the story still remains the same. The location the protagonists have entered turns out to be undesirable and dangerous, meaning they both want to get out. But before they can do that, they need to complete the primary tasks they've been given. Jack having to help Atlas save his family from Andrew Ryan, Lockhart having to find the man who works at the same company he does. And when these set objectives are finally reached, assumptions get turned upside down and the rabbit hole they're stuck in seems to grow too deep to be escaped. So, in a nutshell, we, the audience, end up in a mysterious dystopian-esque location which we get to explore through the eyes of an uninformed, unaware person.
What excuse do we have not to sculpt and sculpt and sculpt until the job is done?
The lead character is where Bioshock and Cure admittedly deviate from each other the most. This difference, however, can above all be attributed to the fact that they occupy two entirely different forms of media. One is a multi-chapter interactive experience, the other just a 2-hour movie. Since Bioshock is a video game, Jack is presented mostly as a wordless blank shell, allowing us, the gamer, to project ourselves into his shoes. In Rapture, we are Jack. But in A Cure for Wellness, we can only be a spectator, meaning the film has to make us feel something for the protagonist in order for us to actually care about anything that's going on. Because of this, Lockhart is given a tragic backstory featuring a dying mother and a non-existent father, which is not the case at the beginning of Bioshock. And as the story advances, the characters' backgrounds drift even further apart, it turning out that Jack has been tied to Rapture from birth, something Lockhart doesn't share when it comes to the wellness center. But even though the launch pads are different, at the finish line the two protagonists end up in a very similar situation. They have both exited the rabbit hole as a new person, entirely unlike what they were back when they first entered. Lockhart free of his former greedy self, Jack either a gracious savior or a downright evil oppressor. Both entirely changed and reformed by just this one location.
It was not impossible to build Rapture at the bottom of the sea. It was impossible to build it anywhere else.
At first glance, Rapture and the Wellness Center can aesthetically seem like two very different places, simply due to the fact that one is a city at the bottom of the ocean and the other is not. But if you turn your eyes away from the outside and focus more on what's inside, you can again start to notice a plethora of running similarities. Both locations were created for seclusion and privacy reasons, built by eccentric wealthy men who couldn't get along with the rest of the world, inhabited by an isolated dystopian society of people who have gone mad over time, shadowed by a dramatic historical backstory that unravels as the story advances, similar even down to smaller details like the fact that both narratives feature supernatural scientific elements which are explained and hinted at by worm-like creatures. In Cure, it's the toxic revitalizing water that the eels live in. In Bioshock, it's the sea slugs containing Adam, the thing that makes Rapture run. When comparing these two locations, it's important to remember not to judge a book solely by its cover. The exteriors might make them look like two different places, but when it comes to their contents, the differences begin to fade, and fade fast. Both Rapture and the Wellness Center are ominous, remote communities that turn out to be an evil, inescapable thematic hell.
They told me, son, you're special. You were born to do great things.
In Bioshock, the primary theme is above all about the absence and unreality of true free will. A Cure for Wellness, as the title suggests, is more about the dissatisfaction and constant desire for more built into the human nature. So two entirely separate motifs, right? Not quite. Though the themes of Bioshock and Cure might indeed seem different on their own, they also happen to work the other way around as well. Very much like Jack, Lockhart doesn't enter the Wellness Center out of his own free will, but because he was ordered to. And on the other side we have people like Frank Fontaine and his followers who were given a place in Rapture, but ultimately weren't satisfied with just that and wanted more, sparking a war which ended up destroying the whole place. In addition, as Dr. Vollmer does with his patients, the inhabitants of Rapture are more than willing to kill little sisters just to get their hands on the supernatural elixir they desire. So again, the deeper you look into these two entirely different narratives, the more you start to realize just how alike they really are.
A man chooses. A slave obeys.
Before A Cure for Wellness, one of the most Bioshocky films audiences had was 2013's science fiction thriller Snowpiercer, excellently directed by Bong Joon-ho. But although Cure does identify with the video game property even more, is it the true Rapture adaptation fans have been waiting for? Well, no. Simply because no project will ever be Bioshock unless it features the name in the title. But it is an intriguing, in my opinion, entertaining narrative experience which tackles a lot of the same questions, and it is a shame how the quirkiness and the non-existent marketing made it fall short of its commercial potential. At the end, since the Verbinski Rapture project fell through and has been buried for a decade now, can there possibly still be any hope left for a proper Bioshock movie? Luckily, it's more possible now than ever before due to the fact that after the success of Deadpool, Hollywood has become obsessed with R-rated endeavors. The studio that currently owns the rights to the project, Sony, seems to be relying heavily on R-rated stuff right now, so I don't see why they wouldn't capitalize on one of the most original and powerful properties they possess. It doesn't have to cost $200 million, and it is sure to pay itself back on just half of that. And even though the original Bioshock doesn't really translate to film well, because Jack is a lone, empty shell of a protagonist, you can easily solve this by changing things up. For example, you can take narrative elements from Bioshock Infinite's Rapunzel story and set it in Rapture. You can have a Booker DeWitt-esque lead sent down there by some employer to fetch a mysterious young woman who is somehow tied to the city's existence, to Big Daddies and to Adam. Together they then set out on a trek through the underwater metropolis in search of a way back up to the surface, growing fond of each other the further they go. You have multiple paths to take, it's just a matter of finding the correct writer. On top of this, you even have the option to work with series creator Ken Levine, who is not only just a video game guy, but by far one of the most talented and prolific storytellers working today. So, Sony, I see you're super into R-rated stuff right now. Why don't you take a look at this property, which by the way is way more creative and interesting than another Venom project, and do it right, please, because I finally want a great video game movie. I want Bioshock, damn it. Thanks very much for watching through. Be sure to check out A Cure for Wellness if you're interested, and if you guys want a Bioshock movie, be sure to stalk, harass and disturb Sony until they either cave in or go mad hearing about it. Thanks a lot.